Hi, and welcome to the last evening event in Wonder. I hope you've all really enjoyed the week and have enjoyed some of the events. We'll be hosting tonight. My name is Hannah and this is Priscilla. And
Sorry, Hannah, you go first. It's so nice to see you tonight for our last event. So throughout the evening, we've got a Slido up, which is a little link that you'll find in the comments, I think. We're just going to be asking you the same question as this event is called. So how much difference does Jesus' resurrection make? We'd love to hear from you and see what you think. Amazing. So it's been an amazing week. Hannah, what have been some of your favourite bits of this week?
Oh, my favourite bit of the week. I've been quite enjoying all the evening events actually. And I was able to go along to the Zoom cafe actually after the talk on agnosticism on Wednesday, and that was really good. It was lovely to kind of chat through some of the questions that came up. Yeah, that was great. Did you have a best bit of the week?
I did really enjoy the quiz actually. It was nice to interact with people. I find just looking at a screen and watching can be quite draining. So it was nice to see people at the quiz. Yeah, strange, isn't it? Term's nearly over, and it's nearly a year since lockdown started. I've been thinking about what I would have done differently had I had the chance to do lockdown again. I've been looking at like crazy challenges people did throughout lockdown. I wish I'd just taken the opportunity to do something really crazy, like, I don't know, get up at 5 every morning. Something weird. I don't know. What did you do a lot in lockdown?
Ooh, what did I do? More the first lockdown than anything. I did think, oh, okay, this is the time to try a new hobby. I managed to get my bike out from the dust that it's been sitting under for the last few years, which has been nice. Get that, although that did end up in a couple of crashes into a hedge, but that's a story for another time. Yeah. Yeah, what else have I done? I've been doing a lot of reading as well. I've been trying to get through.
What have you been reading?
Pardon?
What have you been reading?
Oh, a few different things. I try to keep it a little bit of fiction, bit of non-fiction. Mm-hmm. One book that I read I don't know, it must have been the summer, early lockdown, was a book called The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. I've got it here. You can see a picture of the cover. And yeah, no, that it was really good. It's entitled, it's got a subtitle of Belief in an Age of Skepticism. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's kind of split into two halves. The first bit is tackling some kind of big kind of questions or kind of reasons for doubt that people have in Christianity. Things like, why does God allow suffering in the world? Isn't Christianity just about following rules? And then the second half goes on to talk about some kind of great reasons for faith, both a bit of kind of evidence for God, evidence for Christianity, and also kind of why it's worth looking into, why the message of Christianity is such good news. So I really recommend that if anyone fancies getting a copy.
Yeah, if you do want a copy, we would love to give you one. Just honestly, message the Warwick CU Facebook page, and we'll be really happy to just send one your way if you're interested at all. It's not too long a read. I mean, it's a little bit in depth, but it should be good. So if you ever wanted to read something, I've just been taking a quick look at the poll we put out. Do fill that in within the next 30 seconds if you would like. The main responses I've got, 50% of people voted one, that Jesus' resurrection makes no difference at all. 50% out of 10. 50% said 5. So clearly no one thinks Jesus' resurrection makes any difference at all. So we'll see about that at the end of the evening. And that is the perfect opportunity to introduce Andrew, our speaker, again for tonight. Hello, Andrew, again.
Hello again.
makes it seem like I don't want to see you again. But it's good to see you tonight for our last winter event. I have a really important question to ask you. Everyone has been wondering this throughout the whole week. What is that bike on your wall?
I don't really know how to answer that apart from to say it is a bike on my wall. If you mean, does it work? No, it doesn't. It's just like a sort of sculpture of a bike, I guess. I saw it in a window of a shop in Brighton. I thought it was cool. I bought it. I put it on my wall. That's all there is to say, really.
It looks very cool.
Yeah, very cool. Very, very arty.
Yeah. Well, the only thing left to say is that if you have questions at all throughout the evening, please go on the Google form and type them in, and we will either get them at the end or you can come on to the Zoom cafe afterwards. Amazing. Andrew, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us, either if you're here for the first time tonight or if you've been joining us through the week. And again, with your Friday evening to discuss this question: wonder if Jesus' resurrection makes any difference in a pandemic. And it's good to have the poll and realize that half of you think it doesn't. So that's a challenge for me to see if I can persuade you otherwise. And I want to actually begin. We're going to look together at the account of Jesus' resurrection as it's narrated by John. We've been following John's writings all of this week. John is one of the disciples of Jesus. He's also the author of one of the biographies in the New Testament known as John's Gospel. And so we'll be looking at that and the account of the resurrection. But firstly, I want to look at the account of a miracle that Jesus did. One of the most famous miracles, the feeding of the 5,000. And I'm going to read a little bit about it. And we're going to ask the same question about that. What difference does the feeding of 5,000 make in a global pandemic? And then we'll look at the resurrection. What difference does that make? So this is the way that John records what happened. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing those who were ill. So Jesus had done some miraculous healings. It had got people's attention. There were now huge crowds following him. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. Talked a bit about the Passover last night if you were here. When Jesus looked up and saw the great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with a piece of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Now, this account of the feeding of the 5,000 is narrated in all 4 of the New Testament accounts of Jesus' life, one of his most famous miracles. And it really is an extraordinary miracle. I mean, this is what they say happened. You had a boy who had 5 loaves. I haven't got any loaves in my house, but I have got some scones because my mum is very sweet, and in lockdown she thought I might be miserable, and occasionally she sends me fun things in the post. And she went to this company that sends Cornish cream teas to you. So I got 4 scones in the post and some clotted cream and jam, and I've eaten 3 of them, but I've got 1 left. So here's a scone. I guess that's pretty equivalent to a barley loaf. And I know lots of you at Warwick do maths, but so let's do the maths together. So there was 5 loaves of 5,000 people, so 1 loaf for 1,000 people. I've got a knife even sharper than the one that Luke used in his rather scary lunchtime video, if you saw that. So that means 1 loaf for 1,000 people. So half a loaf for 500 people. Check my maths so far. I can cut that into 5. A fifth of a loaf for 100 people. A fifth of a fifth for 20 people. half of that, that's for 10 people, okay? And I could cut it. Well, let's do it. Why not? Let's keep going. 5 people. Okay. I reckon that is that much per person. 5 loaves. So you do get, you get some. It's not like nothing. You get a little bit. Yum. It's going to be hard to eat the rest of it. Now it's diced, finally. But I'll try to join it back together with clotted cream afterwards, after this talk. But they all had as much as they wanted for lunch. And they ate and were satisfied. And then Jesus collected up the leftovers. One of my friends in Latvia is a pastor there. And before he was a Christian pastor, I don't think he was in the mafia, but he might have been. He's that kind of character. He's very streetwise, wears a black leather jacket. He's very shrewd. Anyway, basically he became a pastor at first because at the end of communism in Latvia, people wanted to reconnect with everything that was banned under the communists. So people started going back to church because religion was banned, because communism was an atheist ideology. And so being a sort of shrewd entrepreneur kind of guy, he thought there's money to be made here because people are going back to church. This is obviously something to get into. So he decided to become a pastor. He wasn't a Christian, he didn't believe any of it, but he thought that, this is a bit of a racket. So he became pastor. And he says he used to, on Saturday night, he'd get drunk and sleep with his girlfriend, and on Sunday night he'd go and preach a sermon in this church. In fact, there's another story about him actually, because he's ended up being pastor of the Reformed Church in Latvia. But the reason for that was when he went to register a church, the official said to him, "What kind of church are you?" And he didn't really know there were kinds of churches. So he said, "Oh, what kinds are there?" He says, "Oh, we got the Catholic Church." "How many Catholic churches?" 10. No. Lutheran? How many Lutheran churches? Oh, 12. No. Baptist Church, etc. Reformed Church. How many Reformed churches? 1. I'm Reformed Church. Because he thought, I'll go for the niche. That's basically the one reason. Anyway, he's such a character, this guy. But he said he used to smoke a cigar at that point. And when he got to the story of the feeding of the 5,000, he said, "I had to smoke a lot of cigars." Because he was trying to work out how Jesus did it. Well, it wasn't a Christian. But here's this account in all of the eyewitness biographies about Jesus doing this extraordinary thing. And he was very stressed because he couldn't work it out. And then he read in a sort of skeptical book that in fact it was just the power of Jesus' personality was so strong that he persuaded people that they felt full, even though they'd only eaten that much. He was so chuffed with himself because he worked it out. And the next day he went to church and he preached this sermon. And so clever. And he said, "Oh, well, of course, what happened was this." And Jesus just made people feel full. And there was an old lady in the church, he says, who hadn't really heard because she was deaf. But on the way out of church, she shook his hand and says, "Thank you so much for your sermon, Vicar, because God was so good to us in the gulags." And he felt wretched. He was a Christian woman who'd been persecuted under the communists, and she'd been sent to labor camp, and she trusted Jesus and it got her through. And she hadn't really heard his sermon, she just heard it was about Jesus, and she was thrilled. "Oh, thank you so much, Pastor." And he realized that for him it was all just a game, religion was an industry. But for this woman, she put her real trust in it. And suddenly his clever sermon just felt wretched. Because people didn't follow Jesus because they just thought that the miracles were a metaphor. They followed him because he did them in front of eyewitnesses. And there were 5 loaves and there were 5,000 people and there was leftovers, and that is not normal. And so people realised this is not just an ordinary human being, this is someone with incredible power. In fact, they conclude, when they saw this sign that Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." It must be someone powerful from God, they thought. Now, the question we're asking this evening is, but what difference does that make? Because there was one hungry group of people 2,000 years ago by a lake, or by the Sea of Galilee up in the north of Israel, and then Jesus fed them once. I mean, great, there's been a lot of starving people since then, and the feeding of 5,000 hasn't done them any good. And you might think the same about the resurrection. I mean, maybe it was true, but so what? There was one dead person who came back to life 2,000 years ago. Well, great, but there's a lot of people who died since then. A lot of people have died this year from the pandemic. What difference does a miracle so long ago actually make now, even if you grant that it happened? Well, the trouble is, I think we misunderstand what Jesus' signs are for. And he calls them, interestingly, signs. And if you notice that as I was reading it, they're called signs. He doesn't use the word miracle, or there's a word wonder, which is the theme of this week. But he doesn't call them wonders. He calls them signs. I've got a sign here. It's a bit small. You can't really read it, but I'll see if I can move my laptop a bit closer to my wall. Probably still can't see that. Let me just take it off. There we go, the Royal Borough of Greenwich. That's where I live, and I'm very proud of it. It's a beautiful place. I live just next to Greenwich Park. The observatory on the top of the hill, the 0 degree meridian goes through my house. I've mentioned that already. I'm very proud of it. But I'm not that proud of this sign, to be honest. I mean, it's one thing I just printed out on my computer. It doesn't look very good. But a sign to Greenwich is not as exciting as Greenwich. I mean, if you want to get to Greenwich, this might help you get there. And you think, oh, I've arrived, and you get excited. Come and visit me sometime after lockdown. But the sign itself, it'd be weird, wouldn't it, to have the sign on your wall? I mean, I'll be honest, that is not part of my usual decor. I've got a nice bicycle. I don't bother with the sign because it's just a sign. The point of the sign to Greenwich is what it's pointing to, which is Greenwich, where I live. And it's a bit the same with the signs that Jesus performs. The point is not the sign in and of itself, but what it signifies, what it points to. And people at the time, they didn't get that. So after Jesus had fed these 5,000 people, this is what happened. Jesus crossed the lake, and then people followed him. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus answered them, "I tell you, you're looking for me, not because you understood the signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." In other words, the reason you're looking for me is because you got free food and you'd like more free food. But this was about more than that. Jesus goes on, "Do not work for food that goes off, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you." He goes on to say one of his most famous statements, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. This is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all he's given me, but raise them up on the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son," Jesus the Son of God, "everyone who looks to me and believes in me shall have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day." Now, we got to understand this rightly. You might say, "Oh, it's just a metaphor then. Life is just a metaphor." No, there's a real event at which Jesus really feeds 5,000 people. Anyone can speak in metaphors or say lovely sounding things. Jesus got people's attention because he actually did things. But the thing that he actually did was a sign. It was pointing to his true mission, which was to bring eternal life. It was pointed to the fact that, as he says, "I will raise people up on the last day." And he's talking about the final day of judgment, when every single person who's ever lived will appear before God, and he will sit in judgment and decide our eternal destiny. And Jesus says, on that day, those who trusted me will be raised up physically. Now that's really important to understand, because if Jesus' mission had been to sort out all hunger, in the world, he's failed. And that's obvious, isn't it? Because there's been hungry people for the last 2,000 years. Jesus came a long time ago, and there's still famines. If he'd intended to feed every mouth, he didn't manage it. If he'd intended to heal every disease, he failed. I mean, Jesus did some extraordinary healings. You can read about them in John's account. My favourite one, by the way, is the one where Jesus heals a man born blind, and Jesus' opponents don't believe that he did it. And they launch a massive investigation into it. And it's quite comedy, actually, because they just will not budge from their presuppositions that Jesus cannot have done it. But all the evidence says that he has. And they haul the guy's parents up in front of court and say, is this the man that you say was born blind? And they go, it's our son, and he's definitely blind, and so on. Anyway, Jesus did miracles, but there's other blind people in the world who are still blind. And there's other people who are ill. And there's other people who die. If Jesus was trying to do a miracle for every situation, there's not enough of them. I mean, we need more of them, don't we, now? People are dying of coronavirus. I mentioned yesterday, I think, about my friend. He's got a brain tumour. He's got a year to live. He's a Christian, actually, but Jesus hasn't stopped him dying of cancer. But Jesus says, no, you've got to understand that the things that I did 2,000 years ago were signs. You're interested in me, he says, not because you saw the signs, but because you had lunch. And it's just a warning that I guess some people want Jesus to jump through their hoops and dance to their tune. What we really want is a genie in a bottle, Jesus. So we can rub the bottle and he'll say, your wish is my command, like the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. And Jesus says that's not what it's about. I've got my own mission, but it's a great mission. It's to bring eternal life on the last day. That's not just a metaphor. It's not just a lovely concept. He's talking about actually resurrecting people from the dead physically. But what he did 2,000 years ago is a sign of that. I've shown, I've argued that from the feeding of the 5,000. I want to now go to the resurrection of Jesus and argue the same thing. So here is John chapter 20. If you ever want to find it and read it yourself afterwards, please do. Everything I've said this week pretty much has come from the writings of John, both from his gospel and then from a letter he wrote, both of them in the New Testament. But here's the account of Jesus' resurrection from John's gospel. Actually, I'm going to read from just where we ended yesterday with the crucifixion, and we'll get the burial of Jesus and then what happened later. So Jesus has just been killed, and then later Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate, the Roman governor, for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 35 kilograms. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices and strips of linen, in accordance with Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one that Jesus loved, and said, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." I want you to notice something very important here. The disciples are not expecting a resurrection. I mean, they should have expected a resurrection because Jesus had predicted it, and the Jewish scriptures had predicted it. They ought to know, but it's kind of to the skeptics' advantage that they didn't expect it, because there's no question here that they sort of persuade themselves of what they really would like to believe to be true. That they conned themselves, wishful thinking. No, they're going expecting to find a body, and they find it empty, and they're very confused. Where's he gone? Who's taken him away? Where's the body gone? So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outrun Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked at the strips of linen lying there, but didn't go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. the cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. First, the other disciple who'd reached the tomb first, finally, the other disciple who'd reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. Now, it's quite hard to understand what's going on here. Jesus died, they've buried him. They go there then 2 days later on Easter Sunday, the first Sunday, and they find the body's missing. They don't understand. And then Peter and John get there, and when they go in, they see the grave clothes folded up, and then they believe. What is it about what they see that makes them conclude that Jesus has resurrected? We'll come to that in a minute. The body's gone, the grave clothes are there, but then the evidence gets a bit more explicit, because the next verse, Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two messengers in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and another at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." At this she turned round and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't realize it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I'll get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Don't hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and to your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I've seen the Lord." And she told them that she said these things to her. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. You remember I talked about this yesterday? How can you tell that Jesus was really dead? So not on Wednesday, we looked at on the agnosticism talk, because you check, the crucifixion marks. This is Jesus. The disciples were overjoyed when they see the Lord. Now Thomas, doubting Thomas, was not with the other disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." He said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." And Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Well, here's the evidence for the resurrection, and they were sure about it because they were there. They met him, they checked out his wounds, they touched him. This is not a metaphor, this is an actual event. But the first to get it, they realize even before they see Jesus alive. They see it just when they see the grave clothes. So I want to read that verse again, and then I'm going to put up a little illustration, or I think Daniel's going to put it up for us in a second. Here, let me read you the verse again. Simon Peter came along with him, went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still wrapped up in its place, separate from the linen. I think what's going on is this, and excuse the photo of me acting this out. I'm just going to pin that so I can actually see it as well. This was me in lockdown 1. That's what I spent my time doing. So if you open the tomb and you find a dead me, I would look like the picture at the left, right? That is me in my Easter clothes. I'm not a corpse, but I'm pretending to be a corpse. My second picture is me being rude, but if a teenager had been there, you'd find clothes discarded, like in a heap like that. Sorry if that isn't true of you and you're a teenager, but that's what I did when I was a teenager. If there were grave robbers, then you'd see the third picture. You would see everything gone because they'd have taken away the grave clothes because fabric was expensive and maybe something can be salvaged. But instead what they see, I think, is the right-hand diagram. They see the clothes. I mean, obviously he wasn't wearing a rugby shirt, but you get the idea. They saw the clothes wrapped around his body, and then the clothes wrapped around his head, separate from the clothes around his body, lying really just where they were in place. Now, if you see that in a tomb, I mean, what do you think is going on? Jesus seems to have passed right the way through the clothes. It's like his body's just, vanished or and left the clothes behind, exactly in the position where they were when they were wrapped around him. And what they realize here is it's not just that Jesus has been sort of biologically resuscitated, but that his body has gone through the tunnel of death and come out the other side as a transformed resurrection body, the beginning of a whole new world. If you've read The Lord of the Rings or seen the Lord of the Rings films, you may know Tolkien was a Christian, the author of them, and he captures this idea in the death and resurrection of Gandalf. Remember, Gandalf disappears into that big chasm in the first film, and then he comes back, but he doesn't come back the same. He dies as Gandalf the Grey, and he comes back as Gandalf the White. And this is what Tolkien's trying to get at. It's like Jesus he's back from the dead, and it's still him. I mean, he's still got the marks in his hands. You can tell it's still him, but he's transformed, glorified. He's got a new, glorious body that will never, ever die. And what that means is that Easter is more than just one miracle that happened 2,000 years ago to one person, but it's a sign. It's a sign that the new creation has begun, that God is going to transform and fix the whole world. That promise that he made, that if anyone trusts in him, that God would raise them up on the last day, it's happened to Jesus first. He's already been transformed, and those who trust him will also be transformed. Now, in other words, the final accomplishment of what Jesus has done is not yet visible. We've got to wait until the day of judgment, until the end of time, until the day when every single one of us and everyone who's ever lived will stand before God on his judgment day. And then we will be raised if we've trusted in Jesus. We will receive eternal life. Now, it's really important that we understand this, that this is a promise about the future with a sign of it in the past. And that is crucial. Let me just explain why. If all you've got is a promise of the future, then anyone could make it. Anyone could say that. It could be empty words, wishful thinking. Wouldn't it be nice to believe in a heaven? And, you think coronavirus is grim, but it's okay because everything's going to be perfect one day. Well, okay, that sounds like good religious rhetoric, but why should I believe it? Well, you should believe it because of what happened in the past. The sign, the precedent, the proof. Jesus as the first one who was resurrected, as a proof of all those who would be raised in him or after him. I had a vaccination yesterday for COVID, and I know I don't look old enough, but basically, for some weird reason, vicars get to go first, and I don't particularly think that's fair. I mean, it seems crazy to me that we go before policemen and teachers and things, but anyway, we do. Don't complain at me about that. Tell the government off. But I found out the vicars could get it, and I thought, well, I'll get it because it just means I can go and visit vulnerable people without being worried about it. So anyway, I got the vaccine, and I feel pretty terrible today actually. So I think I've got a reaction. But you should still get it. Don't be a vaccine skeptic. Get the vaccine. Anyway, one of my friends tells the illustration of when he was at school. And it wasn't the COVID vaccine, it was the MMR vaccine or the BCG vaccine, whichever one you have there. And he said he's terrified of needles, even though he's a big rugby playing bloke. And he remembers being in the queue outside the matron's office as people shuffled forward to get their vaccination. And he was really scared. And he thought to himself, be rational. And he decided that what he would do was see what happened to the guy ahead of him in the queue, who is this little weedy chap. Let's call him Andrew. And as they shuffled forward in the queue, Andrew went into the office and the door closed. And my friend said, I listened carefully and I could hear no blood-curdling screams from inside the room. I thought, that's a good sign. He said, I looked at the floor and I could see no pool of blood seeping from under the door. I thought, that's a good sign. But he says the clincher was that the door opened and Andrew came out smiling with a little tiny plaster on his arm. And my friend thought to himself, be rational. If he got through, then you can get through. You know, in other words, it's rational to believe that it's going to be okay because of the precedent. And that is what Jesus' resurrection means about death. If I just told you, oh, why not believe that one day everyone will live again? You'd say, well, it's a nice idea, but why should I believe it? It just sounds like a made up fairy story, happy ending. But if, as a matter of history, in front of eyewitnesses, Jesus fed 5,000 people and Jesus came back from the dead, then there's a precedent for it. It wasn't just that he was resuscitated, he passed through the grave clothes to begin a whole new world, the foretaste of a glorious transformed future. And so Christians believe that about the future because of what we believe about the past. I think it's a pretty good inference. If you're into maths or logic, it's a pretty good syllogism, isn't it? Jesus' death was not the end of him. That means that death is not the end of everybody. That means that death may not be the end of me. I think it follows very logically. But don't expect Jesus to deliver you from all illnesses. Don't expect Jesus to deliver everybody from hunger. Don't expect that if you follow Jesus, he'll be like the genie in a bottle and you can rub the lamp and he'll give you whatever you want. Christians have broken relationships. Christians go to funerals of friends. Christians face disappointments, redundancy, hunger, persecution. But Christians look forward to the final day when Jesus will raise them from the dead. And they believe that not because it's a sort of naive hope, wishful thinking, but because of the precedent of what happened to Jesus. You see, we've got to understand that Jesus' miracles, they were a sign of a future, a sign of the glorious future that he has in mind for those who trust him. Well, thanks for listening. I'm going to stop talking. You may have questions. I may see you in the Zoom cafe afterwards, but I'm going to hand over to Priscilla and Hannah to tell us what happens next.
Thank you, Andrew. It's great to be able to think about how a miracle that happened a while ago actually makes a huge difference to now. So we have one question for you so far. If you have any more questions, you can quickly stick that in the chat. So the question is, if Jesus is so transformative, why are so many Christian leaders found out to be evil? I think this is possibly talking about the Ravi Zacharias news that came out recently.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question. If you don't know, Ravi Zacharias was a very famous Christian leader who died recently and had a global ministry, did lots of talks at universities, a bit like this one. And then it's been discovered that he was a sexual predator who abused lots of women, and it's all beginning to come out. There's been a big investigation and it's really horrific, and he's let a lot of people down. And so rightly the question comes, are Christians all hypocrites? And how come there's all of these terrible evils in the church? And it's a good question. And I find it, it's very sad, and I don't want to defend it at all. But I would say a couple of things in reply. The first one is that you shouldn't judge a movement by its misrepresentatives. So the fact you find a rogue so-called Christian who turns out to have been a fraud doesn't mean that Jesus is a fraud. And there's a silly analogy of that. I would say no one argues that you shouldn't trust doctors because of Harold Shipman. If you don't know the story, Harold Shipman was a serial killer. He was a GP and poisoned loads of his elderly patients. I mean, loads of people. He's one of the most prolific serial killers in the UK's history. And, it all came out in the papers and it was awful. And but that doesn't mean that your doctor is also a serial killer, right? So there are some rogues in every profession, and that's very damaging to people's trust and so on. But it's not rational to conclude from that all of them are like that. So you can't say, oh, every vicar is a sexual predator, therefore. But there are some who are. So I mean, so it doesn't take away the criticism, but it's not rational to conclude from that Jesus is a fake just because some of his so-called followers turn out not to be the real thing. The second thing to say is that Jesus himself predicted this. So Jesus didn't say, and the church that I found is going to just be brilliant and it's never going to have any problems and you can always trust everybody in the church. I mean, you may know that Jesus had 12 followers, 12 apostles, and one of them betrayed him so that he would be killed. Judas Iscariot, and it's become, a household name, isn't it? If you say someone's a Judas, but that was within Jesus' group of 12, and Jesus knew that would happen, and he called it out before it happened. So Jesus is never saying in a kind of naive way, everyone who purports to follow me is the real thing, and you can trust them. Jesus said, expect fakes. In fact, the phrase you may have heard of, wolves in sheep's clothing, you may know that phrase, that actually comes from Jesus' teaching, because he sometimes called his followers sheep. And he says, but some of them are actually wolves that look like sheep. So when something terrible like this happens, I mean, it's very sad and I'm gutted about it. And in fact, I know some people who are sort of worked closely with that organisation who are very traumatised by it. But it's not a surprise. And I don't think it discredits Jesus' message, because Jesus is saying we need rescuing from sin and evil. He's not saying this is a beautiful world with no evil in it. Jesus isn't naive about sexual abuse. The Bible talks about that. He's not naive about lies or hypocrisy or power abuses. The Bible talks about all those things. So I think the fact that we see them, you go, well, yeah, I mean, that's what Jesus would have told you to expect. But it doesn't invalidate the fact that he is offering us real forgiveness. I think that's all I can say, but a good question.
That's our only question at the minute. But do feel free to keep asking questions and definitely come along to the Zoom cafe if you're interested at all. We won't bite. Just come along, ask whatever you will. I thought we'd take a little quick look at the Slido again. I don't know whether a lot more people have voted or people have been drastically swung, because all of a sudden 50% of people are on a 10 with the difference Jesus' resurrection makes. So I'm glad there's still someone on a 1, but you can vote again. But
can I just say about that? I mean, that's very affirming. So thanks. I'm not expecting that after one talk on a Friday evening, you go, oh, well, that's all solved. Then I've changed my mind completely. I mean, I'm not so naively optimistic that I think it will totally change your mind. I'd love it if this sets you thinking on a train of thought that means you look into it, you read it for yourself, you check it out, you start investigating. You don't just take my word for it, but you begin to read yourself some of John's biography and so on. So please make this the beginning of a thinking process. For me, it took me months, and I think it would take you months. But I mean, if you change your mind tonight, then great. But I'm not expecting that particularly.
Definitely. Amazing. So that brings us to the end of Wonder. That is our last event besides our Zoom cafe. So follow up. We'd love to keep talking to you about the things that have been said, the things that you've been thinking. I'm just going to shut my window quickly because there's a car on. But we have an alpha course that will be running on the 8th of March. It's just a way that you can come and find out more about Jesus and what he did, why he rose from the dead. So we would love to see you there. We really do want to keep talking to you and answer any questions that you have. That brings us to the end. Do come to the Zoom cafe. We'd love to see you.
Just to remind you as well that all the videos from the week, all the kind of 5-minute lunch bars and all the evening talks will all still be on the Warwick Christian Union YouTube page and Facebook page. So if you've missed any of those and would like to catch up, then then please check them out. And if you have any kind of questions post Wander when you watch them a bit late, then we'd love for you to get in contact. We'd love to chat to you, answer your questions. If you'd like someone just to talk a little bit more about reading the Bible, or would like to read the Bible with you, please get in contact. We'd love to chat with you.
We would, yes. So thank you for coming, everyone. Thank you so much, Andrew, for coming and speaking to us. And we'll bid you good night. Bye.
Bye.